It was a still morning, the kind that smells like rain and promises nothing. Dust clung to every corner of the porch, and the trees, full of secrets, swayed lazily in the wind. On that porch, under a cracked roof that had seen better years, old Jonah sat, his hat tipped low over his brow. The world around him felt heavy, as though it was holding its breath for something yet to come. But the day was about to change because a child had been left there. The boy was no more than 5, maybe 6, and he was staring up at the old man with wide, startled eyes. His face was dirty, his clothes too big, and his small hands clutched something tightly, a ragged doll that had seen better days. The silence between them was thick, oppressive. Jonah didn't know how long the boy had been sitting there. The sun had just begun to creep over the horizon, but the boy hadn't made a sound. He wasn't crying, wasn't fidgeting. It was almost as if he had been placed there by fate, not by a hand. Jonah's weathered hand gripped the rail of his porch, the familiar roughness of the wood against his skin, grounding him in the strange moment. He wasn't the kind of man who knew what to do with children, especially children like this one. His own had been lost to fever years ago, and his heart had hardened since then. He wasn't sure why the boy was here or who had left him, but the certainty in his gut told him it didn't matter. Something was about to unfold. The boy's eyes, those porcelain eyes, were not just wide with confusion. They held a story Jonah couldn't begin to fathom, but one that would soon tear through this quiet town like a storm. Just as he was about to speak, the sound of horses' hooves approached, but not just any horses. They were heavy, their gallop sharp, urgent. Jonah stood quickly, his bones creaking in protest. He looked down at the child, whose face had gone pale, eyes darting around nervously, as if searching for something he already knew he wouldn't find. "Where'd you come from, boy?" Jonah's voice was rough like gravel, more from years of silence than from the cold morning air. The child didn't answer. Instead, he reached for something from his pocket, a small folded note worn from being carried too long. He handed it to Jonah, the paper trembling in his tiny hand. Jonah took it with reluctance and read the words scrawled across it. "Don't let him take me. Don't let them take me." Jonah's heart slammed into his chest. He crumpled the paper in his hand as the sound of galloping grew louder. His eyes, tired and cautious, shot toward the road just as the group of riders appeared on the horizon. But one thing struck him. A woman was among them, and she was coming straight for his porch. Jonah hadn't seen her in years, not since the funeral. The woman from his past, a widow with fire in her eyes. And now she was coming for the child. Subscribe now to unravel the story and what comes next. The woman rode in like a storm, her horse kicking up dust as though the earth itself was trying to bury what was coming. Jonah's heart hitched. He recognized her immediately, even through the years and the dust. It was Mabel, a woman he hadn't seen since the day she buried her husband. Since that day, the memory of her had been buried deep in the corners of his mind, kept there with the ghosts of so many things lost to time. Mabel's face was hard, but not in the way Jonah remembered. The sharp angles of grief had softened into something sharper, something that spoke of survival. Her black dress, now faded and worn, clung to her form like the burden of years. She was no longer the young woman who once had eyes full of hope. Now her eyes were different, sharper, colder, and yet there was something in them that spoke of a fight that had yet to end. She slowed her horse as she approached the porch, the hooves quieting as the tension between them thickened. Jonah's gaze flickered to the boy. The child, still clutching his doll, was shaking. The hairs on the back of Jonah's neck stood up. "Mabel," Jonah muttered, his voice a croak. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to return, especially not like this. "What in the hell are you doing here?" Mabel didn't answer right away. Instead, she dismounted, the leather of her boots scraping against the earth. She stood for a long moment, looking at Jonah, before her eyes fell to the boy. There was a brief flicker of something. Pain, perhaps. But it was gone, as quickly as it appeared. "You've got a child on your porch, Jonah. A child that doesn't belong to you," Mabel said, her voice low but steady. The words carried a weight, a warning, but Jonah wasn't sure what to make of it. The boy's eyes darted from Jonah to Mabel, and for the first time since he had arrived, he spoke. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling, "don't let her take me." Jonah felt a tightness in his chest. This wasn't just a matter of a child being abandoned. There was more to this, something darker, that was buried beneath the surface. He'd spent too many years on this earth to not recognize that look of fear in the boy's eyes. It was the same look Jonah had seen in too many faces. Men, women, children, those who had known loss, abandonment, and the cold hands of justice that came too late. Jonah took a step closer to the child, his hand instinctively reaching out to protect him. "What the hell is going on, Mabel? What are you doing here?" Mabel didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, as though gathering herself before speaking. "This boy, Jonah, he's mine. Or he was," she said, her voice strained. They came for him, just like they came for me. He's a child of my past. The past I've tried to bury. And now, they're after him." Jonah frowned. The pieces didn't fit together. The past was something Mabel had tried to escape. A widow. A woman left with nothing but the broken pieces of a life she couldn't rebuild. And yet, here she was, claiming this child as part of that past. "The past never stays buried, Mabel," Jonah said, his voice rough. "What do you mean, they're after him?" Her gaze hardened. "The ones who took everything from me, Jonah. They're coming for him too. And I can't let that happen." Jonah's mind raced. The wind rustled through the dry grass around them, but the tension between him and Mabel was deafening. He knew there was more to this. So much more. But he didn't have the time to dig through it now. He could see the fear in Mabel's eyes, the same kind of fear that had been there when she lost her husband, the same kind of fear that had haunted her for years. Before Jonah could ask another question, the sound of horses approached again, but this time they were closer. Mabel's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening with determination. "They're here." Jonah didn't need to look to know what was coming. He could feel it in the air, the weight of impending danger. The boy was still trembling, clutching his doll tighter now, as if it was the only thing that could save him. Jonah had no answers, only questions. And the answer to one of those questions was coming in the form of the men riding toward them. But Mabel was already stepping forward, her hand outstretched toward the boy. "Stay close, Jonah. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this." As the riders drew closer, Jonah could see their faces, and he knew, without a doubt, that the boy's past had caught up with him in a way that none of them could escape. Hit subscribe for the next chapter in this dangerous tale. The first man appeared over the rise, his silhouette casting a long shadow against the harsh morning sun. His horse was lean, its muscles coiled, ready to spring. The rider was tall, dressed in dust-ridden leather, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face from the heat of the day. He didn't speak, but his presence alone was enough to send a cold shiver through Jonah's bones. Jonah stepped back instinctively, his hand tightening on the wooden railing of his porch. He had seen men like this before. Men who lived for control, for power, and who would do whatever it took to get what they wanted. This wasn't just a group of men looking for a runaway child. No, this was something much darker, something more calculated. Behind him, a second rider appeared, then a third. They moved with precision, each man riding in line like soldiers marching to a death they were paid to deliver. But it wasn't just the men that caught Jonah's eye. It was the way they held themselves. There was a fearlessness about them, a dead-eyed confidence that spoke of many sins carried without remorse. Mabel stepped forward, her eyes cold and determined. The wind picked up again, a sharp gust that sent her hair whipping around her face. But she didn't flinch. She had seen men like this before, too. She knew what was at stake here, what would be lost if she didn't act. Jonah looked at her, then at the boy. The child hadn't moved since he spoke those desperate words, his small hands still clutching the doll as though it could shield him from the approaching storm. "Stay behind me," Jonah whispered to the boy, his voice rough, a desperate promise. He wasn't sure if the boy heard him, but the child nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving Mabel's. The riders halted in front of the porch, and the leader. He was the first to speak, his voice low and dry, like sandpaper scraping across skin. "Mabel," he said, almost as if testing the name, letting it linger in the air. "Benton," Mabel replied, her voice calm but hard as steel. Jonah's eyes flickered to her, trying to piece together the history between them. But before he could speak, Benton laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound that seemed to echo in the empty space between them. "You still think you can outrun your past, Mabel?" Benton's voice was a sneer. "You can't run from what's coming. None of you can." Mabel's hand hovered over the gun at her side, her fingers brushing the worn leather holster. It was the same gun she had carried for years, the one that had seen too many nights filled with regret and longing. Jonah knew that look. It was the look of someone who had made up their mind about something they didn't want to do. "I'm not running from anything, Benton," Mabel said, her voice hardening. "I'm standing. And I'll stand for this boy, too. He's not your prize to claim." The other men on horseback shifted, their eyes narrowing at her words. Jonah could feel the heat of the moment rise, the tension in the air growing thick with impending violence. He wasn't a fool. He knew these men weren't here to talk. They weren't here to reason. They had come for something, and it wasn't a friendly handshake. "You've got a choice, Mabel," Benton continued, his voice lowering. "Either you step aside, or we'll take what we came for." His eyes flickered toward the boy, and Jonah saw it, the hunger in his eyes. The boy was nothing but a pawn to these men, a tool for a bigger game they were playing. The wind howled again, a gust so strong it nearly took Jonah off his feet. But Mabel stood firm, unflinching, her eyes locked onto Benton's, her jaw set in defiance. "I'm not stepping aside," Mabel said, her voice firm, unwavering. Jonah took a step forward, placing himself between the riders and Mabel. His heart pounded in his chest, but his body didn't hesitate. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this much. If these men thought they could intimidate her, they had another thing coming. Benton's lips twisted into a grin, but it wasn't the kind of grin that spoke of victory. It was the grin of someone who knew the game was already over, and all that remained was the cleanup. "You should have stayed out of this, Jonah," Benton said, his tone low, dangerous. Jonah didn't answer. He didn't need to. His gaze flicked back to Mabel, to the boy. He had a sense of what was coming, and as much as he tried to deny it, he knew this wasn't going to end peacefully. Not today. Benton made a motion with his hand, and one of the men behind him dismounted, a grim expression on his face. He walked slowly toward the porch, his boots crunching on the dry earth with every step. He was carrying something Jonah couldn't see yet, but he had a feeling he wouldn't like it. As the man reached the porch, he held out a long, black rope. It was freshly cut, still smelling of the earth it had been taken from. "The boy's to be branded," Benton said, his voice matter of fact, as if it was simply a matter of business. "And he'll be marked for what he is. A bastard." Jonah's heart skipped a beat. The rope was no mere symbol. It was a message. The boy was to be branded, marked with the same cruelty that had followed Mabel all these years. And Benton knew that Jonah couldn't allow that to happen, not while he was still breathing. Jonah could feel the weight of the rope in his hands, and for the first time in years, he felt like the old man he used to be, the one who had fought for something worth fighting for. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe for the continuation of this fierce showdown. The rope burned cold in Jonah's grip, like a snake coiled and waiting. His fingers trembled, the old scars on his hand protesting against the tight hold. But he didn't let go. No, this was more than just a rope. This was a link to everything Mabel had suffered, to everything she had tried to outrun. And now it was about to claim the boy, too. Mabel's eyes darted between the men and Jonah, her body rigid with the weight of what she was about to do. Jonah could see it, the hesitation, the raw fear hiding behind her defiance. This wasn't something she'd chosen, something she had expected. No, she had thought she could bury it, hide the boy from the dark, but the past had a way of surfacing when you least expected it. The man with the rope, tall and broad-shouldered, held it out with grim determination. "You can't stop this, Mabel," he said, his voice like gravel being ground underfoot. "It's the law. He's a mark of shame, and that's something you can't wash away." Jonah's jaw tightened. "You think you can do this to a child? You think you can break him just like you did with her?" he snapped, pointing toward Mabel. The man didn't flinch, but Benton's grin faded for a moment. The silence between them grew heavy, thick with the realization that Jonah wasn't backing down. But it wasn't just Jonah's defiance they had to worry about. It was the boy. The boy, his eyes wide and pleading, was looking at Mabel now, as if seeing her for the first time. Jonah could see the questions forming in his eyes, the terror, the confusion, the pain of being tied to something he didn't understand, something that he couldn't escape. Mabel stepped forward, her fingers tightening around the grip of her gun. The sound of it, the sharp click of the hammer, echoed in the silence, cutting through the tension like a knife. But she didn't raise it. Instead, she simply looked at the boy, her face softening for a moment. She knelt down, her hand resting gently on the child's trembling shoulder. "This boy is not a mark to be erased," she said, her voice rough. "Not by them, not by anyone." Her words were quiet but firm, carrying the weight of years of pain and regret. The boy's face softened slightly, as if the first light of understanding was beginning to break through the darkness that had settled in his chest. The man with the rope stepped closer, but Mabel didn't back down. Her eyes were cold now, locked onto Benton's, daring him to make the next move. Jonah didn't know how, but he could feel it in the air. The choice was coming. A choice between survival and submission, between the past and the future. And Jonah wasn't about to let them win. "You don't have to do this," Mabel said, her voice quieter now. "You don't have to be part of this cycle. It's not too late to break free." Benton's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something almost human passing through them. He hadn't expected Mabel to fight like this. He hadn't expected her to hold on to the boy with such fierce determination. She was a woman, broken by the past, he thought. A widow, a survivor, nothing more. But she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting. "Get the boy," Benton said through gritted teeth, "and take her down if she resists." In that moment, Jonah made a choice. He moved faster than he thought he could, his legs carrying him in a burst of instinct. His hand shot out, grabbing the rope before the man could take another step. The world around him blurred, his heart pounding, his chest tight with anger and adrenaline. "Let go of it," the man growled, but Jonah didn't release the rope. Instead, he pulled it toward himself, his grip unyielding. In that instant, time slowed. Jonah's mind raced, the weight of what was happening, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He could hear the wind whispering through the trees, the boy's breath quickening, the thumping of his own heart in his chest. But through all of it, he knew one thing for certain. If he let go now, they would win. "Jonah, no!" Mabel shouted, her voice a warning. But it was too late. The momentum of Jonah's body and the force of his will pushed him forward. His shoulders collided with the man holding the rope, sending him stumbling back. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The riders, the men on horseback, stood still, watching. Mabel didn't move, her gaze locked on Jonah. The boy's eyes were wide with confusion, but something else, something stronger, had begun to stir inside him. It was the same thing Jonah had seen in Mabel's eyes for years, an ember of rebellion, a spark of defiance. Jonah shoved the man hard, sending him tumbling to the ground, the rope slipping from his grasp. The air felt thick, the silence screaming louder than any words could. "Get off my porch," Jonah growled, "and take your brand with you." Benton stood, rage flickering in his eyes, as the first rider began to unsheath his rifle. Jonah could feel the shift in the air, the final moment when everything would either break or burn. The sun, which had risen quietly over the land, now burned down upon them with the force of 1,000 memories, each one sharper than the last. The air smelled of dust and sweat, of fear and defiance. Benton stood like a statue, unmoving for a moment, as the words Jonah had spoken hung in the air, thick and heavy. His hand hovered over his holster, his jaw tight, but something about the way he looked at Jonah had changed. It was no longer the confident sneer of a man in control. It was a flicker of doubt, and that doubt festered into rage. "Step aside, Jonah," Benton growled, his voice low and dangerous. He hadn't expected this, a simple, old rancher, standing in his way like some kind of hero. The gunman had underestimated him, and now that mistake was about to cost him. The riders behind Benton shifted nervously, their eyes darting between Jonah and their leader. Jonah could see it. They were waiting for a sign, a moment of weakness. But they were also waiting for a chance to follow Benton's lead, to see if the old man would fall back, if he would let them reclaim their power. Jonah didn't move. He couldn't. His heart thundered in his chest, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't allow this boy to be branded, couldn't let the cycle of violence and shame continue. Not after all these years. Mabel's past, the boy's future, they were too intertwined, too fragile to let these men walk all over them. "You won't hurt him," Jonah said, his voice firm and low, but unmistakably sure. "And you won't hurt her either. Not on my watch." The boy, who had been silent until now, suddenly moved. He didn't speak, but his small hand reached for Mabel's, his tiny fingers gripping her sleeve. Mabel's gaze softened as she looked down at him, but there was something else there now, something unspoken, something like hope. But before Jonah could take another step, a rifle cracked like thunder from behind him. The shot wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at Mabel. In a blur, Mabel's arm shot out, her gun drawn in an instant. She fired in response, the shot splitting the air. The man who had aimed at her staggered back, his rifle falling to the ground with a thud. He didn't fall, but the blood spreading across his chest told the story all too clearly. The rest of the riders froze, their faces registering shock, confusion, and fear. Benton, his face twisted in fury, barked an order, but Mabel was already moving. Her eyes, cold and focused, never left Benton. Her voice was steady when she spoke, even as she kept the gun aimed at the group. "This is where it ends, Benton. You'll take your men, and you'll leave. Now." The stillness that followed felt like an eternity, like the air itself had frozen in place. Benton's men looked to their leader, unsure. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in an instant, everything erupted. Benton, his patience exhausted, drew his own pistol and aimed it at Mabel. The click of the hammer was sharp, like the snap of a whip. But Mabel didn't hesitate. Her fingers squeezed the trigger again, before he could make his move. The bullet found its mark, striking Benton square in the chest. He didn't fall immediately, but his hand dropped to his side, the revolver slipping from his fingers. He staggered, his face contorting in disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. His men, now fully realizing that this wasn't a fight they could win, began to back away, some mounting their horses, others standing motionless, as if caught in the grip of their own fear. Mabel stepped forward, the gun still raised, her eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "Go," she said, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises, "before you lose more than you've already taken." The riders hesitated for a moment longer, but then, one by one, they turned and fled. The sound of hooves pounded in the distance as the men retreated, leaving behind nothing but the thick silence of the land, the smell of gunpowder, and the blood on the ground. Jonah stood there, his heart still racing, his hand, still gripping the rope, slowly loosened. He glanced over at Mabel, his eyes meeting hers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The battle had been fought, the line had been drawn, and they were still standing. The boy, now standing with his hands in Mabel's, looked up at her, his face uncertain. But something had changed. Something in his eyes had softened, the edge of fear replaced by something closer to trust. Mabel's gaze softened too. She knelt down before the boy, her hand resting on his cheek. "It's over now, little one," she said, her voice gentler than Jonah had ever heard it. "You're safe." Jonah watched them, the two of them standing there, one marked by the past, the other a new soul shaped by it. He could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet victory of survival. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't a full, complete victory. But it was something that felt like redemption. And as Mabel stood, her eyes meeting Jonah's once more, she nodded. A small, imperceptible gesture, but it carried with it everything they had fought for. The promise of survival, the promise of moving forward, no matter the cost. But as Jonah turned to leave, something caught his eye. A figure standing alone on the horizon. Another rider, or something worse? Stay with us as the story unfolds. Subscribe for the next chapter of survival. The sun hung heavy in the sky as the last of the riders vanished from sight, swallowed by the vast horizon. Jonah stood still, his breath slow but steady, as if the weight of the moment was finally settling into his bones. The quiet that followed was almost too much to bear. The world around them, holding its breath after the storm had passed. Mabel had already turned away, her hands resting on her hips, her face set in a look of grim determination. The boy, still holding her hand, hadn't spoken much since the chaos had ended. His small, fragile form seemed to shrink under the weight of the past few hours, but his eyes, those porcelain eyes, were no longer filled with the terror that had once consumed them. Instead, there was something else there now, something Jonah couldn't quite place, but it was a quiet resilience. As Jonah moved toward the porch, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted. They had survived. The boy had survived. And somehow, so had Mabel. Despite everything, despite the years of running and hiding from a past that never let go. "I never thought I'd see this day," Jonah said quietly, his voice low but filled with a sense of finality. "Didn't think I'd see you again, Mabel. Certainly didn't think it would be like this." Mabel didn't turn to look at him. She didn't have to. She knew what he meant. The years had changed them both, but the land, the memories, it all stayed the same. It was the same dry dust beneath their feet, the same sun burning overhead. Only the people changed. And sometimes, not even that. "You can't run from the past forever, Jonah," Mabel replied, her voice distant, almost lost to the wind. "I thought I could, but it's always been here, lurking, waiting to catch up with me." Jonah nodded. He understood that better than most. The past had a way of seeping into the cracks, worming its way back into your life when you least expected it. He had run from his own ghosts for years, but this moment, standing here with Mabel, with the boy, he knew it had all led to this. The boy pulled on Mabel's sleeve, his soft voice cutting through the silence. "Where are we going now?" Mabel looked down at him, her face softening for the briefest of moments. "We're going where the wind takes us," she said, her words slow but full of promise. "We'll make a new start. Somewhere far from here. Somewhere safe." Jonah watched them, the small family that had formed out of the wreckage of their past. There was no grand victory here, no perfect ending. But there was something that felt like peace, something that was earned through blood and struggle. As they began to walk away, Jonah's gaze flicked to the horizon once more. The figures on horseback were gone, but the danger of the world still loomed out there. The boy would grow up with a new name, a new life. Mabel would carry the weight of her past like a scar, but she would carry it forward, not behind her. Jonah turned back to his porch, his eyes scanning the land one last time. He knew it wasn't over, not really. But for today, for this moment, he had done something that mattered. He had fought when it mattered, and that, he thought, was enough. The boy and Mabel walked down the dusty road, the sound of their footsteps blending with the wind as the sun dipped low behind them, casting long shadows on the land. It wasn't the beginning of a new world, but it was the beginning of something. Something quiet, something that would last. And perhaps that was all that could be asked for. As the wind whispered through the trees, Jonah looked up, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the past on his shoulders. Instead, he felt something else, something like hope. Stay tuned for more stories that fight for what's right. Subscribe and join the journey.